Today, we're going to talk in detail about the wars of the Great Plains in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s in the kind of central core of the American continent in the Great Plains region that stretches from Saskatchewan and Alberta in Canada all the way down into Texas in the south, encompassing North and South Dakota, much of Montana, Kansas, Nebraska, etc. In some parts of the Great Plains, you have great soil for farming. Kansas and Nebraska are an example of that. Much of the corn and other crops that we consume in the United States come from those states. Idaho, you have a strong agricultural sector. But generally, further to the north, in the Dakotas, the conditions are more arid, and you have less of an inclination towards agriculture and more towards rearing of livestock. Many of the thousands and thousands of cattle that are produced in the United States each year are raised in this region. And this was the case in the 19th century. The Great Plains were a region consisting of a long stretch of grassland, essentially traversing the center of the North American continent. And like in most parts of the world where you have extensive grasslands, you have pastoralism, people choosing to follow herds of animals rather than to engage in sedentary agriculture, planting crops. Before the advent of electricity, modern air conditioning, gas heating, this was a very, very rough place to survive in. That's true for the European settlers that arrived in numbers into this region in the second half of the 19th century. But that was also true of the indigenous cultures that survived in this part of the American continent for centuries. In fact, this kind of harsh environment of extensive grasslands resulted in the development and thriving of very militaristic cultures relative to some of the other indigenous cultures, particularly to the southeast. The Plains Wars, the wars between the United States federal government and the different indigenous nations of this part of the American continent, the North American continent, weren't like we generally think of it today. Today we kind of have this idea that the indigenous nations were sort of living in harmony with nature, minding their own business. The United States federal government showed up and began appropriating their land. Ultimately, the United States federal government did appropriate their lands and extinguish these cultures from much of the Great Plains. However, in the beginning phase of the conflict, we don't see we see conflict between multiple expanding empires. You have the expanding empire of the American government. You have the expanding empire of the Lakota, the expanding empire of the Blackfoot Confederacy. My point with this is that these indigenous nations were very, very formidable opponents. They had armies, strategists, generals, every bit as sophisticated in their thinking as their federal counterparts. And they won many great victories relative to what people might think today. Several of them were notable. In fact, the indigenous nations of the Great Plains were probably the most successful at resisting encroachment by settlers compared to any other group of any other indigenous nations in the continental United States. And of course, their success in resisting in part fueled a very, very draconian response by the federal government, and ultimately a genocide of a magnitude that we often don't see in other parts of the American continent, with the federal government being much, much harsher with nations like the Lakota, the Cheyenne, etc., than with some other nations. And of course, this is due to the fact that these warriors of the Lakota and the Cheyenne, they put great fear in the hearts of many U.S. Army generals, settlers, etc., because they were so militarily capable. In some respects, they were similar to many of the pastoral communities of Central Asia, just as with Mongolia, Turkestan, etc., what's now Kazakhstan. You see the emergence of very powerful military coalitions of cavalrymen, of people who live on horseback, more or less, the Mongols, the Turks, the Huns, etc., in the first millennium AD and the first half of the second millennium AD. You have a similar kind of military power emerging in the Great Plains. So why did the nations of the Great Plains have more military successes when facing the U.S. government compared to many of the other nations of the American continent? Well, the reason for this was their mastery of cavalry warfare. Their way of life revolved around horsemanship. They relied on horses for their survival, and as a result, they were much more mobile, much harder to strike at, and they could strike in many different locations very rapidly due to their great mobility as a result of their being masters of mounted warfare. And of course, this is something that we see in the old world as well. In Central Asia, you have the Mongols, you have the Turks, many different cultures that evolved in kind of the grasslands of the great steppe of Asia, where they also became militarily successful due to their mastery of cavalry warfare. And they lived in a manner similar to the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains, following herds of animals from watering hole to watering hole, often fighting over these watering holes, fighting over the meager amounts of water available, and developing cultures that were militarily powerful as a result. You can go all the way back to the Huns of the late Roman, who invaded the late Roman Empire. The Huns originated in Central Asia, in the great grasslands, and they were very militarily powerful because of their mastery of cavalry warfare. And this same pattern held true in the 19th century. These superb horsemen were very difficult for the United States Army to defeat. That's why we often see the term cavalry being synonymous with the U.S. Army, because it was the cavalry that had to do battle against these indigenous communities, due to the fact that foot soldiers were not mobile enough to strike at them and overtake them. Horses were not native to the North American continent at the time that European settlers first arrived. The last indigenous horse species in North America, Equus scotti, became extinct around 12,000 years ago. It was likely rendered extinct by the first humans to arrive in North America. So the cultures in the East, when they encountered Europeans, they encountered horses for the first time. And we have records of their reactions to seeing what to them were kind of monstrosities. If you look in the account of the Spanish conquest of Mexico, the Aztecs saw the Spanish cavalrymen as kind of half human, half deer hybrids at first, because they had no context for horses. When the Spanish arrived, they of course brought their horses with them, but some of these horses escaped and moved north into the Great Plains, where they encountered the perfect natural environment for horses. great grasslands with little tree cover, and they became what we now call the wild mustangs. These are the descendants of Spanish war horses, who are themselves the descendants of Arabian war horses. So the mustangs have a very, very long lineage, and they were domesticated by the indigenous nations in the Great Plains, who then independently mastered the art of cavalry warfare. The indigenous nations that mastered cavalry warfare were able to fight off the U.S. government, not just the U.S. government, but also the Mexican government. In fact, the Cheyenne and the Lakota would raid fairly deep into Mexico, where they would have to fight off Mexican lancers, who were cavalrymen who defended the northern border of Mexico from not just the Lakota and the Cheyenne, but from the Apache and other cultures. In fact, the northern Mexican states in the 19th century played a role in the dispossession and destruction of some of the Indian nations of the American Southwest due to this constant back and forth conflict. Horses also allowed for the indigenous nations to capitalize on the consumption of buffalo. These tribes had always, and even tribes in the eastern woodlands of the United States had emphasized the consumption of buffalo. But on horseback, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, etc., were able to better harness energy to hunt and to procure large numbers of buffaloes for consumption. And of course, if you look at this map of the range of the buffalo dominated much of the North American continent prior to the middle of the 19th century. While the buffalo were not exactly difficult to hit for arrows, spears, etc., they could be formidable opponents. Particularly the bull buffaloes could be very aggressive. And the American bison, which we refer to when we talk about the buffalo, became the main source of food for the vast majority of the Plains nations. And the migration of these giant herds of millions of buffalo across the Great Plains would serve as the backbone for the cultural life of these nations, due to the fact that the people followed the herds. And in order to wipe out these nations, whom they were very, very resistant militarily, the United States federal government ultimately decided to put an end to the buffalo in order to starve many of these indigenous societies. In the year 1873 alone, 1.5 million buffalo were killed. And they weren't killed for meat, they were killed to wipe them out. So that with the buffalo wiped out, food would become scarce amongst the Plains nations. And you can see here this image of this giant pile of skulls. These are all buffalo skulls, kind of one heaped on over the other, to produce this giant mass grave of buffalo. And you can get a sense of just how many were killed. So as food became more scarce with the annihilation of the buffalo, or near annihilation of the buffalo wasn't completely wiped out. The American bison still exists. It's made a gradual recovery over time. But nothing like the millions of bison who once roamed the North American continent. With the decline of the buffalo, many of these nations faced very severe economic pressures. The threat of starvation loomed large. And because the threat of starvation loomed large, many of these nations began to fight amongst themselves. For example, many of the lands that were taken initially from the Lakota were not lands that the Lakota originally lived on, but lands the Lakota took from the Crow and other nations after 1851. These empires were expanding due to the pressures of having to secure more access to herds, to dwindling herds. So, in time, these very warlike societies began to bump up against the westward expansion of the American nation. Facing starvation, the Lakota people, under the leadership of a leader named Red Cloud, who had a vision of great victory, rose up and began to battle against settlers and then against the United States Army. And Red Cloud actually won his war against the United States Army, the so-called Red Cloud War. What had happened was that what we call the Bozeman Trail, which was the trail leading through Montana, the Lakota were able to overwhelm the trail. They were able to massacre a large number of U.S. Army troops in what was called the Fetterman Massacre. And the Fetterman Massacre is kind of the first great defeat of the U.S. Army by an indigenous army. The Lakota slaughtered a little under 100 American soldiers and mutilated the corpses. There's an interesting story from this. There was a 17-year-old bugler named Adolf Metzler who actually fought off several of the Lakota with his bugle. Since the Lakota were so impressed with the victory, or the valor, rather, of this young man, his youth, and how brave he was. His was the only corpse they did not mutilate, and they actually buried him in kind of a formal buffalo robe that they reserved for honored warriors of their own tribe. So the U.S. government wanted to conclude hostilities with the Lakota. The Civil War had ended only 3 years earlier. Federal troops were still in the southern states. There weren't the resources necessary for a full-scale military subjugation of the Lakota. So the United States signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which gave the Lakota rights to a very large chunk of land. The Lakota were at war with the Crow. The Crow Nation was allied to the U.S. government. It was never at any point indigenous nations versus the federal government. The federal government always had allies among the indigenous nations. Rather, just like with prior to independence, you had the European colonial powers and their indigenous allies against other European colonial powers and their indigenous allies. You know, the French were allied with the Choctaw, the British with the Chickasaw, and they waged war against each other. It's the same kind of situation here. The Crow and the Lakota were actually blood enemies. In fact, for a long time, the Lakota were called the Sioux. And the reason for that is that the Crow called them that. It means snake in their language, which is not the actual name that the Lakota gave themselves. So the Lakota gradually demanded that they not be called that. And for the sake of our discussion, when I say Lakota, I'm referring to the Lakota, the Nakota, and the Dakota. Those are three different groups, but they all fall under the banner of the Lakota for this discussion. I won't get into the specifics of why some have one name and not the other. Okay, so resources were scarce, but Red Cloud had won his war. And for a 5-year period, there was peace. The government had still continued slaughtering the bison, which weakened the prospects for the indigenous nations, including the Lakota. But the U.S. government was not battling the Lakota directly. This changed in the early 1870s when the absolute worst thing that could have happened to the Lakota happened. Gold was discovered in Lakota territory. So suddenly you had large numbers of prospectors who were itching to go into the Dakotas and to Montana and eastern Wyoming to take large swaths of land for prospecting. And of course, the United States government wanted to get access to that gold. It would be similar to if huge petroleum reserves or natural gas reserves were discovered somewhere today, right? Suddenly that land is much, 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 much more valuable. And the Lakota were determined to resist any new encroachment by American settlers. They were led by Sitting Bull, the Lakota chieftain you see pictured there, who was a great tactician, who, along with his ally Crazy Horse, managed to defeat a prominent U.S. Army force. The U.S. government sent a large contingent of troops, part of which was led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, who had been a great hero of the American Civil War. He led his troops. He made the fatal error of splitting his troops in the face of the Lakota-Cheyenne alliance, believing that they were less capable than they actually were. So having split his army into two sections, with him personally leading one section, his force was much weaker than it would have been, and he led his force directly into an enemy ambush. And a large number of U.S. cavalrymen were killed. Around 275 U.S. soldiers were killed in total, and Custer himself was killed. And this is the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, which was one of the biggest upsets in U.S. Army history, where an alliance of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors managed to completely defeat an incursion by the U.S. Army. Of course, there was gold at stake, so this defeat didn't actually weaken the federal government's resolve to get a hold of the gold. It caused them to double down on the number of troops that were sent. Ultimately, the federal government determined that it would take up to 20,000 soldiers to subdue the Lakota, and then began to send large numbers of troops, supplies, including Hotchkiss guns, artillery, weapons that the Lakota could not resist. And over time, the Lakota were defeated. Many of them began to face severe starvation, and one by one, the bands of Lakota warriors surrendered to the federal government. So the Lakota were defeated. The most militarily powerful of any indigenous community that the federal government would face on the American continental United States, was over time militarily liquidated. And the Lakota faced starvation. The federal government moved in. There was the idea of getting the Lakota to farm, which the territory of the Black Hills in South Dakota was not suitable for farming. That land was not arable. It was too arid. There was not enough, meaning there was not enough rainfall. And on top of that, farming was completely alien to the Lakota's culture. So the federal government began to supply food to the Lakota on these reservations because they were starving, but there was always the fear that the Lakota would revolt. Eventually, a prophet from a community called the Paiute in eastern California western Nevada, began to have visions. His name was Wovoka. He was also called Jack Wilson. Wovoka had a vision. And in this vision, he ascended to heaven and he encountered God, who, according to Wovoka, told him that Jesus was coming again, but this time as an indigenous person, and that he was going to wipe out all of the traces of European society west of the Mississippi River. So all of the trains, the factories, the mines, the animals that had been brought from Europe, sheep, goats, pigs, etc., chickens, all these animals would be gone. And the land would return to the way it was before Europeans arrived. Not only that, the dead would come down from heaven and join the different nations resisting the federal government in fighting by their side. Now, there were some conditions that had to be met for this to happen, according to Wovoka. One of those conditions was that the indigenous nations had to stop fighting each other. They had to stop fighting one another and face the federal government. Secondly, they had to get rid of practices of self-mutilation and any kind of mourning that involved self-mutilation. So if they did this, and if they danced what was called the ghost dance at particular intervals, which was a particular, in the Great Plains, dances were a huge part of the religious life of these nations. They had many different types of dances, sun dances, moon dances, etc. And all of these dances were carried out as religious rites. The ghost dance was no different. If this ghost dance was carried out for a certain period of time, the dead would return to life. They would, led by Jesus, help the indigenous peoples defeat the federal government. And after this, a kind of new, millenarian age would result, in which the indigenous people would return to their state prior to the arrival of Europeans. The ghost dance was supposed to be a pan-indigenous movement, meaning that all of the different nations of indigenous people, according to the prophet, were supposed to come together and through unity drive out the U.S. government. There were problems, though. This idea of fighting alongside the spirits of your ancestors was considered very profane to some of the cultures in the American Southwest, the Navajo, the Apache, and so this limited the influence of the ghost dance in the Southwest. So it dramatically reduced the military power that had been part of the prophet's vision. Well, that didn't change the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the U.S. federal agency in charge of governing the Lakota and the Cheyenne and the other communities. That didn't change their paranoia about the ghost dance. The federal government was very afraid that there would be a repeat of the massacre at Little Bighorn. So they were determined to stop the appeal of the ghost dance from spreading, and over time they began to punish the Lakota and others who were participating in the ghost dance by confiscating weapons, by limiting the rations that were given to them. Remember, the Lakota were facing starvation. And this would have disastrous consequences. Due to the paranoia surrounding the ghost dance, the Bureau of Indian Affairs determined to completely disarm the Lakota. When they went to the Pine Ridge Reservation to collect the arms, the Lakota were required to hand over their weapons, and one deaf Lakota warrior didn't understand, presumably, what was going on. As there was a struggle over his weapon went off, and the federal troops fired on the Lakota. They ended up killing around 200 civilians, most of them women, children, and elderly. You can see here the image of the Lakota chief Spotted Elk after he was killed by the soldiers. And after this, the Great Ghost Dance had to go underground. People didn't want to associate with it. Only the kind of true diehards continued the practice. But it did continue. One important thing to note at the end here is that this was not the end of the Lakota or the other Plains nations. It was the end of their formal armed resistance against the federal government, but these nations continue into the present day. And I will give an example of how the Lakota, their culture, had an effect on events much later than what we've talked about. The Lakota had a practice called counting coup. And the way that it worked is that when you went to battle, the highest honor was not to kill your enemy, but to either take his weapon from him without killing him, or to touch him physically and return unharmed. Right? That was considered the height of bravery. Well, in the Second World War, a Lakota soldier, Joseph Medicine Crow, actually stormed into the position of a German soldier and took his weapon from him and took him prisoner. So he actually conducted this ritual. You can see Joseph Medicine Crow here pictured with President Barack Obama after he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in part for his writings about the Battle of Little Bighorn, the massacre at Wounded Knee, and for his military service in the 1940s, for which he had already been decorated as well. But the point of this is to point out that that Lakota history, that the history of the nations of the Plains continues into the present day.